Welcome, conversing listeners. What is the credibility of the faith in a time like this? The Rethinking Church Initiative is launching a new podcast called Credible Witness.
I'm Nikki Toyamasito, and this is Credible Witness, a collection of stories and wisdom from faithful people wrestling with and bearing witness to the credibility of Christian life today. Each episode is an invitation to listen generously and courageously to one person, navigating social tension and moral complexity, negotiating doubts, struggles, and fears, overcoming obstacles and pursuing justice, and living out the convictions of their faith. And every voice reminds us that the church is called to be a credible witness to Christ, a living reality of hope, justice, truth, and love.
It's a beautifully rendered collection of stories that reward a courageous and generous listening. So please check out our show notes for links to the Credible Witness podcast feed, as well as crediblewitness.us. I'm hoping that you'll subscribe today, and I believe you'll be deeply encouraged by the series of episodes to come. Thank you for listening courageously with me, and may God bless this new effort.
Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comment Magazine and Fuller Seminary. I'm Mark Labberton. Welcome to Conversing. What a gift it is today to have Dr. Elaine Howard as our guest on Conversing. Dr. Ecklund and I have been acquainted for a number of years, and I've really admired the work that she has done related to faith and science, and the work that she's doing about faith and the workplace more recently. She's a sociologist who teaches at Rice University. And the book that we're going to be looking at today is entitled Working for Better, A New Approach to Faith at Work. And it's co-authored by herself as well as Dr. Denise Daniels. Elaine, what a great gift it is to have you today on Conversing.
Thanks so much for having me. I've been really looking forward to this.
Well, you know, you have for many years been a kind of bellwether to me of a person who pays great attention to the role of religion and faith in culture and society. Obviously, this is at the core of your work, and you've extended it in many different directions. And it's always felt to me like your work is fresh, it's serious in its scholarship, and it's interesting because it's so data-driven or clarified, perhaps. Driven maybe not be the right word, but it certainly is data-shaped and very helpfully so. So this book that we're going to have a chance to talk about today, Working for Better, A New Approach to Faith at Work, is a book that I think exactly represents part of why I have always admired your work and your writing so much. Before we jump into that, though, I think it would be helpful if listeners could get a little clearer picture of who you are and what it is that has brought you to this particular moment in your own scholarship and work at Rice University and beyond.
Oh, thanks so much for that question. And again, thanks for having me. So I'm a sociologist, and I study group behaviors. And so that's the kind of lens that I bring to the social world. I'm also someone who takes faith very seriously at both the personal level of my own faith. I consider myself a Christian. And academically, I take faith very seriously. I'm a scholar of religion and bring that sociology lens of group behaviors to the study of religion. And for the past number of years, I've been studying the scientific community as a kind of workplace. And so my earlier work is on what scientists think about religion and then what religious people think about science. I've loved that work. So I have a kind of the academic story of what brought me to this book, this new book, Working for Better. And then I have the deeply personal story, and I think both are important. So I was studying the scientific workplace, and I thought, wow, are scientists like everyone else? Are they different? And so why not think about religion in the workplace more broadly? And then the personal story, so that makes total sense as a scholarly trajectory. But the personal story is that I met Denise Daniels at a leadership retreat that was sponsored by the HEB Foundation and held at Laity Lodge. And Denise and I were part of this convening over several years, thinking about, I think in the end they called it leading from the soul. And Denise and I really liked each other. We became friends and we did this wonderful seminar for several years. And we thought, we're not going to see each other. She was at the time on the West Coast. I was in Houston at Rice University, where I still am. And so, what do academics do? We're like, well, let's start a research project together and then we'll get to see each other. Right, it's like the adult play date for academics, right? And Denise brought her own sensibility from being a scholar of business. And Denise has done a lot of research on the Sabbath and thinking about the Sabbath. And I brought my sensibility as a scholar of religion and of science. And we were so excited to join together. We got this grant from the Lilly Endowment that we should acknowledge. And we were kind of off to the races. And we started out just being interested in women's work lives, actually. That was our initial idea for a project. And Lilly came back to us and said, there's not really great research on the whole of the work world, and there's no, kind of huge definitive study. And why don't you do that? Why don't you do that study? And so we were very thankful for that support, and we did the study. We published an academic book with Chris Scheidel called Religion and Changing Workplace. That's more for business leaders and academics of work. And that book we loved writing together. But then we felt a burden to write a book that was specifically for a Christian community. And that's where we worked together on Working for Better, a new approach to faith at work.
So what is this new approach? You say in the introduction that there's been a classic paradigm in a certain way that you, in this book, are both appreciating but also expanding and recontextualizing, you might say. And I'm curious if you could just give us that dynamic between what the primary paradigm has been and what you think this new book is offering.
Well, we have throughout the book this kind of movement from the way things have been to the way things are, and it's pretty data-driven. So, for example, say 50 years ago, there was not much religious diversity in American workplaces. American workplaces were pretty Christian, and they were places, because that was the modal religion in the U.S. It still is, but Christianity has declined to some extent. The number of non-religious people has increased, and the number of people from other world traditions like Buddhism and Hinduism has increased in the U.S. quite dramatically, and especially in certain industries. So the other thing that's quite new is there is just a lot more discussion about bringing our whole selves to work, including our faith. And Christians still really struggle with the desire to compartmentalize their faith from their work and really from the rest of their lives as well. Even though there's been fantastic and just wonderful ministries, I know you've been involved with some, Mark, really powerful ministries on faith in the workplace, still Christians generally struggle to think about how to bring their faith to work in ways that are sensitive to the work environment. The other thing that we haven't thought much about as Christians is what's the difference between individual responsibility, kind of being ethical. There's a lot of talk in our data about people not stealing office supplies. I guess this must just be a massive problem.
It's a massive problem.
So it's just a massive problem. And they thought, that's what it means to be distinctively Christian. We talk in the book some about thinking, moving from that individual responsibility to thinking more systemically. What does it mean to address wrongdoings in the workplace that are more at the level of whole systems? So we're not saying really that the other way of looking at things, the more individual way, the more compartmentalized way, that there's nothing that we can learn from that. We want to honor the other work that's been done, but say, we have new demographic realities. We have new challenges in our workplaces, and that's going to demand some newer data, but also some theological reflection that's a bit different than maybe what we focused on before.
One of the words that you use to describe this contrast is that you're moving from a more individualized approach to a more other-centered approach. I think that is a powerful way of capturing what the whole book really does. You're trying to continuously move in helping people who are working in various settings consider the other and consider how faith actually should serve and bring you to a mindset of engagement and embrace, a radical embrace is the language that you use, of other people, their context, their religious faiths, an embrace in the sense of a radical sort of engagement and honoring of who they are and what their life is about, rather than a kind of over and against approach, which can easily lurk always in a lot of Christian thinking and writing. Is that a fair way of capturing it?
That's exactly right. And I'm in a workplace too, so I feel it. Sometimes in certain kinds of academic organizations, Christian thinking has not always been welcome. And, sometimes I have felt a little bit othered myself. But we do find through our data and through our theological reflection that first thinking outside of ourselves, thinking, who does God want me to care for in this environment? And we really get this from the very powerful idea of the Imago Dei, of understanding at a very deep level that every person is made in the image of God. And so everyone who's walking around and thinking and part of our workplaces has potentially something to teach us because they have that God image. And that was such a powerful way to think through what it means to practice faith in our workplaces as Christians. And I think it's the right way to be, but it's also, I think, more effective when we think about authentically sharing our own faith with others, or just talking about what it means to be a Christian. People are much more apt to take us seriously if we first take them seriously. And
surprise.
Yeah. So it seems, something we should all know, but some of our practices have not necessarily reflected that.
Well, I think there has sometimes been a lurking transactionalism that's underwritten a lot of a Christian approach to work, or almost any context, which wants to functionalize it for the sake of some kind of spiritual transaction. And what you're encouraging instead is a much more humanized, comprehensive, and dignity and value-centered approach to the significance of all of the people that a person might be working with and the systems that they're participating in. And that comprehensiveness is part of the oxygen that I think this book really brings a massive amount of fresh oxygen to a conversation that has always been earnest, always valuable in its own legitimate terms, but from my point of view, has sometimes felt deprived of sufficient oxygen for the whole of the human experience and for the significance of what those casual, normal, everyday exchanges are in a workplace setting or any other setting, but certainly in a workplace setting.
Oh my gosh. So well put. One thing that's coming to mind is that sometimes we as Christians have a lot of fear of the other. So we think first about our own rights. And I don't want to underemphasize discrimination, towards Christians. Especially we found in our data that those who are racial minorities, Black and brown Christians, often face a particular kind of double marginalization in American workplaces where they feel like they're being potentially discriminated against because of their race, but also because of their religion, and they're not sure which one has more importance at a particular time. It's incredibly painful and difficult. But it is so important to think first, what is the value of this person right in front of me? And how can I care for them in all of their authentic humanity? And what does that look like in this particular workplace? And it's going to be a creative endeavor. It's going to look very different in different kinds of work and depending on our position and our region of the country. But I think if we start with that framework, that a kind of expansive creativity will come to us when we need it.
Yes. I've recently become acquainted with the work that Tim Shriver is doing in an endeavor that is related to dignity, which is the main core of what he's about, trying to move as an agent of bringing dignity to all of our conversations and exchanges, as opposed to contempt, which is what he uses as the word to describe the sharpest end of the opposite approach, where we approach the other with contempt because they are not like us, or do not share our religion, or do not behave in the ways that we think might be important. And the contrast to that of living in a culture where we seek to both perceive and elevate the dignity of the people that are around us and the significance of their own choices and habits and associations is a vastly different approach than has often been the subtext of a lot of American dynamics, I think. And it's not just, as you know, it's not just about race, and it's not just about religion, but it can also be about gender. And the trifecta of the number of people who are carrying a triple burden of potential discrimination is real. It's also the case that I think I'm right in saying this, that the preponderance of people that have been most involved in the Faith at Work movement have been white men. And while that's not to suggest that that is inherently a problem, it is also to appropriately suggest, I think, that it isn't inherently neutral either.
No,
at the very least. And
that, that's right.
And
that's right.
And that therefore there are things that really need to be seen. And I feel like, again, in this book, you do a really wonderful job through your research in being able to understand and name some of these things that I think have always been present, but I don't think they've been studied in the way that this book has given us exposure to. So thank you again for that. I do know that one of the things that drives the Faith and Work movement in general is this tension that exists classically between what is sometimes called sacred and secular work. So take us first to that dichotomy and where you land in this book, you and Denise.
So a lot of the Faith at Work ministries, and some of these are great ministries, Mark, have been really trying to break down that sacred and secular notion to get people just thinking through a much more and realizing a much more expansive image of what work can be, that God can be present in work, that we can feel called to work that's outside of historic work just in the church itself, what we think of as historic ministry work. And I think some of that research and thinking and practice has been super effective. But still in our data, people think of their church life is much more spiritual and their work life is much more secular. And it gets even more fine-tuned. So people who work with other people, so those who are in service industries or are in, say, medicine and are in nursing, have a much easier time feeling like God can invade their work in a good way than people who, say, work with money, or people who are much more structural in the kinds of jobs that they do, or even work with structures, building and construction and things like that. And it was this great interview that Denise and I did with this fellow who was an accountant in a hospital and considered himself a sincere Christian. And he said, well, I can really see how the work that the doctors and the nurses do in the hospital, that is so much part of faith, and they can express their faith. But he's like, I'm just an accountant who works with insurance claims and with the financial systems of the hospital. He said, I have no idea how my work could be viewed redemptively or be seen as an act of my faith. And I'm sitting there thinking, mind you, it's not our job to argue with the respondents.
Yes,
that's not what we're there for.
Right.
But I'm thinking oh my gosh, as someone who has a chronic illness, which I do, and has just dealt with poor systems over and over, and the amount of time and agony that can take just trying to get money and reimbursements. I'm like, if you make our systems better in hospitals, then your work is absolutely foundational to the work of other people in the hospitals. And you are helping people, sir. And I just wanted to kind of, gently and lovingly shake him a bit and just say, oh my gosh, you're doing such redemptive work. But he just couldn't see it.
Right.
And so we just, somehow there hasn't been enough done in our churches to help people have a more expansive idea of what work can be.
Right. And you also put your finger on another nerve, which is this issue of moving from the individual to the systemic. Talk about that and what your research has shown.
Yeah, people love to talk about individual ethics. And actually, this is probably going to be a little bit sad for some of the church pastors who are listening, or Christians broadly. But people who are religious and people who are not all think that they're ethical. So like 98% of people in our data think that they behave ethically at work. But then when we got into interviewing a representative group of those we surveyed, we found that they're talking about things like, not stealing office supplies. Apparently, the stealing of paper clips is a nationwide ethical issue. I mean, it was so funny to me. So many people mentioned that.
Right.
And so, they're talking about, just being careful on the timesheets that they put in and really putting in the timesheets that are for the amount of time that they worked. I mean, if we even have timesheets anymore. But so that was easy for people to come up with. But what was really hard for them to think about was, what would it mean to make our workplace better as a whole? So, making sure that you don't steal in your workplace is different from addressing your boss and saying, how can I be part of making this workplace a more honest workplace? What kind of policies can we put into place? How can we change our culture so that this workplace is a more ethical workplace? We talked to lots of people who kind of were secretly ethical. It's much harder to be upfront about it. So you not stealing is an individual change, but you addressing the leaders in your organization about trying to change the organization, that's a more systemic act.
Right.
And I think we need more Christians who are reflecting on how they can use their power wisely. I mean, we found that people had almost an anemic idea of the power that they had, that we thought from just looking at the roles they had and the positions they had and how much money they made, that they probably had a lot more power in their organizations than they thought they did, but often felt either ill-equipped or just didn't want to use that power to move an organization forward.
Right. So let's go into this a little further, because it just strikes me that one of the endemic challenges of evangelicalism, of American culture first, is that it's hyper-individualism. Then you move into the quadrant of religion and particularly, let's say, of American evangelicalism, and you find an even more intensive form of individualism often. And you have parts of American Christianity, therefore, that are really driven principally by the individual. And then you have other parts of the American church that are really driven almost exclusively by systemic issues. And part of this has to do with independent churches versus mainline churches. Some of it has to do with a kind of sociological transformation around what it is that we think really matters most. And each sort of these two dimensions, and there are sort of just two dimensions of this within Christianity. This is different than a lot of other religions. That binary breakdown feels like it permeates at a pretty profound level. Did you discover anything that helped you unlock and understand why there is that difference?
I do think the faith at work movement has been largely Protestant in orientation. And American evangelicalism flows out of American Protestantism to some extent. And we found a little bit different rhetoric from our Catholic brothers and sisters, if that makes sense. So there were better tools for thinking about systems, better tools for thinking about, what it means to change an organization.
Yes.
But there's not been as many ministries and as much reflection in the kind of official faith at work movement from a Catholic perspective. Denise and I talked about this a lot, and just the need for the different traditions within American Christendom to almost come together. There was, in some ways, an activist orientation in our data among the evangelical respondents, meaning they thought the most about how they were going to apply their faith. And often, perhaps unsurprising, it was about witnessing to others or talking to others. The evangelicals were much more likely than other people in our sample to say that they wanted to talk about their faith in the workplace. But the evangelicals didn't talk much about making workplaces more equal or caring about people who made much less money or had less access to time off. Those didn't seem to be evangelical Christian issues to worry about from these data.
Right.
Also, people are not as willing to, I don't know how to say this politely, but they aren't as willing to count the cost. What does it mean to really count the cost of speaking up and changing a system?
Yes.
And that is going to be hard. So we talked to this fellow who was a leader in his organization, and he recognized that women were just very systemically getting paid less, that they were getting, under certain conditions, harassed in the workplace. And he decided to put an official complaint. He talked to us extensively about this example. And he said he noticed that people who complained to the upper administration in the organization eventually got kind of sidelined, and they weren't officially fired, but they were treated so poorly that they ended up leaving. And he said, this might happen to me. He's like, he knew that might happen if he chose to make this kind of formal complaint. And he said, I know as part of my faith that this is what I have to do. And I can't look myself in the mirror every day and not have acted in an official capacity. He said it wasn't just a matter of protecting one individual woman. He, sometimes spoke up individually in contexts where he saw things happening, but he felt very strongly that he needed to lodge an official complaint. And he did. And eventually, over time, he was ousted from the organization. He now works in a job that is really underneath his skill level. And he said, I would do it again. I really felt like that was what I needed to do in that time. And, just as you can't kind of shake people and tell them to do better, neither was it really my, space as a researcher to affirm him and, use him as examples in sermons. But it was really telling that very few people were like that. Very few people, even those who expressed going to church often. We had many people in our sample who went to church more than once a week, which is considered, very regular attendance for the U.S. Even those folks didn't have very much of an idea of how to change organizational systems for the better.
Right. One of the things that you touch on at a number of points, and that I've been thinking a lot about over the last few years, is the issue of fear and the permeation of fear in every dimension, in every direction, it seems. It might be the emotion of this era, perhaps. In any case, I'm curious, how did fear play throughout these various dimensions that you were trying to explore? Because in that case, in the example you just gave, there was a legitimate fear that if he spoke up, that he would lose his job, which in the end he did. And I don't know whether any good was done by his speaking up. That is, did it have some positive consequences, even if it meant him ultimately losing his job? But certainly a lot of people get stopped simply because they're afraid. They feel impotent. They feel inadequate for the particular challenge, or they don't like conflict, or they're not prepared to take the kind of risk that engagement in this wider sense that you're calling for may require of them. So fear must have been present in a fairly thick way, I'm assuming. You say some things about that, but please share more.
Yeah, we talked about fear quite a bit in our first book on this topic, The Religion in a Changing Workplace. And there we talked about fear on the part of employers who are afraid of faith altogether. They just are so concerned that especially evangelical Christians will start talking about faith in a way that will be offensive to the non-religious and to people of minority traditions in the U.S. That wasn't happening very much. So even those who wanted to talk about their faith, when we interviewed them, were so concerned themselves about not offending each other. It would make I'm not sure the evangelical church would be proud of the, the extent to which people are afraid of talking at all about faith. But there was also a fear on the part of Christians of themselves being marginalized. And I think there's not enough support in congregations for workplace action, that many of the Christians we talked to, wanted their pastors to occasionally visit their workplace, or wanted their pastors to provide a space in the congregation for thinking through issues of faith at work, a supportive community outside the workplace. So I think part of the antidote to the fear, and it's a real concern, there is a lot of fear among Christians right now about faith at work. there wasn't the kind of alternative community in congregations to deal with these things and to talk about it and to have the kind of support that people needed so that their identity as a worker was put in the right place in relationship to their identity as a child of God. And I don't mean to be all Pollyanna-ish about it in any way. I do think these very intentional communities where we have space to talk about our work from a faith perspective can be incredibly helpful.
Right, right. I'm struck by the fact that when fear strikes, I think it does two things. First, it raises a question of knowledge. What do I know about the danger that might or might not be lurking? And the second one is a question of power. What could I/we/they do in the face of this power or this conflict that may arise? And I think often congregations are underformed in their ability to actually, we're not underformed as a human being in evaluating the fundamental knowledge of the danger, although we may be radically misinformed and therefore hyper vigilant about something that is part of the subculture that we're in, where we see the danger under every rock or at every possible turn. So
I think that's right.
I think there's that. But also on the power side, that sense of honest evaluation that truly locates us with all of the things that we may already have within our reach as people who have responsibility, who have the ability to speak, people who have the capacity to think, have the capacity to be empathetic, so that it's not about brutality, it's not hostage taking, but it is about trying to exercise appropriate, disciplined, humble, but courageous power. And I was taken a few years ago when I was first working on this. I did an informal study of the curriculums of seminaries that I could reach. It was not many. It was maybe like 20 or 30 seminaries. I couldn't find any evidence that any of those seminaries had any courses that involved courage. That is, that involved talking about, nurturing, cultivating, reflecting on the courage of a faithful church. It's more about boldness, assertion, activism, those are all legitimate things in their own terms, but to not grapple with the question of courage itself felt to me like a serious and noteworthy absence. Does that strike you?
Oh, there's so much in what you just said. A couple of things are coming to mind. Sometimes fear is masquerading as anger.
Yes, right.
And so people get very angry because they're very afraid. The most powerful example of that in my own life is, now my child hates it when I tell this story, but she's allowed me to, and I've written about it formally, so I guess it's okay to say something here. But my child was once lost, and so lost that they had to call the actual safety protocol in the police at her daycare. And she was hiding, and she just hid really well. And, and as a parent yourself, like there's nothing that makes you more afraid than thinking you've lost a child.
Right.
And I was acting completely out of my mind. I was incredibly afraid. I mean, I kind of feel tingles even telling the story now.
Yes.
But when we found her, she had been hiding, had been about 10 feet within, totally within earshot. And all of a sudden, like it was like a switch just flipped, and I was incredibly angry. And I remember the daycare provider put her hand on my shoulder and said, "Elaine, there's a fine line between fear and anger." And I totally see that happening in the faith at work space, is that Christians often are very afraid of being discriminated against. They're very afraid of not being taken seriously. Christians are both overrepresented in the echelons of power and overrepresented among those who are not, who are living on the margins in society. And so there is this constant sense of fear, also fear of change, where will our religion not be the main one anymore? And will we not get respect? And then we get very angry at times. And, my psychology friends will say, when we get that kind of primal anger or fear, we're all of a sudden out of our right minds, right? It's
literally.
We're not in our reasonable, thoughtful, executive functioning kind of minds. That's one thing that's going on. I do think, too, that we have been taught to be afraid. I mean, we live in a wealthy country for many of us, especially people of my demographic, wealthy white people, often live in incredible safety compared to, in safety in lots of ways of looking at safety, financial safety, physical safety. And so it's ironic that in the American church, we are afraid. And so I think there's some reflection that needs to be done on that. It hampers our ability to care for others who really are marginalized and who need our help. Just one more example. Several years ago, there was a robbery on my campus. Someone was robbed at gunpoint and in our student union. And very unusual. This never happened. I've been here almost 20 years. But I suddenly started to feel afraid to go to the student union. And so I made myself go to the student union every day for a while because I thought I am not going to be able to work here and care for students if I'm afraid of my students. I cannot live that way. And it was almost like I had to discipline myself because I became very predisposed to fear. And this didn't happen to me. It's not like the robbery was anything to do with me. It was just I had this, there was an aura of fear around me
infectious.
And I was starting to participate in it. And so I thought if I just disciplined myself to go every day and just talk to students, whoever I saw, I just talked to them a little bit, and that started to go away over time. I thought I can't effectively minister if I'm afraid of the people I'm supposed to be ministering to.
Well, quite, yes.
So just a couple of things that come to mind, but you really hit something there, that there's some fear going on, which is hampering our ability to integrate faith at work, and especially our ability to care for those, I think, that we need to in our workplaces.
One of the things that I think is a great strength of this book is that you tackle a number of different dimensions where fear or other factors might be pre-existing, which cause the table, as it were, of the workplace to be set up in a way that is obviously not fair to everyone who's present, and then full of fear because of wanting to protect how it is set up, often, especially if you're on the privileged end of things. So you do this related to gender, you do it in relationship to race, you do it in relationship to religions. Let's focus on the religions part, because I do think it's really such a significant thing. We know that there's a great deal of disaffection of religion. So you have people who once may have been part of a faith community of some kind who have now distanced themselves from that. Then you have people of the multiple faiths around the world who have immigrated to the United States and or brought the tradition of their family and their cultural context to bear on their lives and their current life wherever they might be in the United States. And then you have people who are in context of cultivating new religious ideas and language that's also happening. And in a hyper individualized culture in general around the US, you have this sense that I get to be my own meaning maker at all times and in all ways. And all of that constitutes, I think, a context in which then it's understandable that there could be caution or fear. But flipping it around as you do in this book, you're advocating that the particularities of all of this difference actually hold great meaning and value. I'd like you to just talk about that.
I think workplaces are one of the last places in society where people are likely to meet those who are different from them. I really do. And our ability to know how to act civilly with people who are different from us, or even love people who are different from us and care for them, is key to our democracy.
Yes,
So
yes.
It's key to civil society. It's key to our workplaces. And I think is an important spiritual discipline that Christians have access to. So our ability to be bent in such a way, I mean, it's not our ability. We've been given this as a gift to care for others deeply because we know we are cared for deeply. So we are not hustling to get our identity and our meaning met through our workplaces. So we come in the ideal sense with an ability and a desire to care for others. And that's very powerful. And it can address some very significant stereotypes that others have of Christians. And some of those stereotypes are founded in reality. There were so many stories that were told to us in our data about very bad experiences with churches. So many people who are non-religious because of very legitimate, painful experiences with churches of their youth. They're almost harder to reach than the folks who were just not raised in a religion, who sometimes have a kind of openness to new ideas.
Right, right. I'm curious, as you were discovering those potholes, I guess you might think of them as being, where people have had an experience that's really upset them, distracted them, made their life averse in an intense way to any kind of religious discussion. What seemed to be the difference between people who may have found themselves in that place and people who maybe even through workplace friendships and workplace activism, like the kind of thing that you're saying about being attentive to the others and the differences and the inequities, what did you find could ever reverse those things? And were workplaces part of it?
So the workplaces that are not a part of it, so we'll start with the negative case first, are ones that suppress difference. So, and that's a real go-to for many workplace leaders. So let's try to, we're all part of this company. Our identity is entirely the company. We don't have any individual differences. Let's not talk about them. It's just too risky.
Yes.
So, and we argue in the book that suppression of faith in particular is not the answer. That when people can bring their authentic selves, in the business world, we kind of call it bringing your whole self to work, are, more committed to their work. They're more committed to their organization. They often see their job as very much a calling. They work more effectively. That creates a much more generative work environment. And one of the chief ways that workplace leaders can do that is just providing safe spaces where people can talk about their difference in ways that don't marginalize others. So there need to be some intentional guidelines. So we need to, not discriminate against others. And some of that is fairly easy to do. So workplace leaders often are incredibly anxious and like, well, what does it mean to not discriminate? And I'm like, you do actually know.
Absolutely.
And so when we talk about,
right.
And there are some pretty specific rules about non-discrimination. But then what's a little bit more assertive is providing some opportunities. So employee resource groups have been incredibly effective in some industries. Faith-based employee resource groups
Explain
alongside
what that
other
means,
kinds
because not
of
everyone
ones.
has had exposure.
Yeah, thanks for asking. So these are groups that are around employee interests and they're really wonderful. It's a wonderful structural idea where employees can meet either at lunch hour or outside of the company in an interest group. And it could be like soccer or something, it could be knitting or soccer, but often they're around faith as well. And they sometimes do things together across faith lines, which can be, they talk about what accommodation might look like in their particular organization. So they're sometimes very practical, but sometimes very personal and very much a community building kind of endeavor.
Right, right. Going back to the pretext at the very opening of the book around becoming other-centered, one of the questions I guess I'm curious about is when you found people that were really free to live with their whole selves in this kind of expansive, radical kind of welcome or hospitality-like way in the workplace toward those who are around them that were very different from themselves, what seemed to be the things that had triggered that capacity for them?
Well, some talked about learning how their workplace was, a place of ministry in their churches. So there were many positive examples in our data of people being able to think through integration of faith and work in their religious organizations. And not just churches, there were also examples in synagogues and mosques as well. So that's one kind of thing. Another kind of thing is knowing that their workplace itself is friendly to issues of difference.
Right.
And that is often a matter of the leader just talking about that in an open way. And leaders are very afraid of leaving groups out.
Yes.
But actually, if they just start talking about the groups that they know of, then more groups come forward. So if they suppress everyone, then everyone feels left out. So I think that's an important distinction for leaders to think through. And then things kind of build upon themselves. So people who start to think about their faith and their work, then they get more opportunities to practice an integrated faith and work. So I remember one of the people we interviewed worked in a meat packing plant, and a really difficult job. And he loved his work, but he talked nothing about the actual mechanics of packaging, which is the division that he was in. But he said, people at work, call me Yoda because I have so many relationships and I'm the unofficial counselor in the workplace. And I've helped people with their marriages and their children. And he had this deep sense of calling to his work, and his location of ministry was really through the relationships rather than through the actual physical work itself. And as he started acting that out, he got more and more opportunities. And for him, he was able to move up in the workplace hierarchy, and it had this work effective kind of effectiveness to it as well. Although that didn't seem to be generally the reason that people were doing it. They weren't necessarily integrating their faith and work in order to move up some kind of workplace ladder, but sometimes it did have that impact.
Well, he sounds like he had both things going, that he had integrity in what he was really offering to people. But the consequence of that was that he was seen as a different kind of leader. Is that
That's
right?
Or yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So I think one of the most important chapters is actually the one on rest. And it is a standalone chapter, as you say in the book itself. Unlike the other chapters that are paired, this is a chapter that stands by itself. And it stands by itself partly because you're making the very important point that understanding human limitations and boundaries, even elected boundaries, not just imposed boundaries, but elected boundaries, to say no to productivity, to my output, to my need to achieve, et cetera, et cetera. So tell us why that chapter is significant as you and Denise were writing this. It feels to me like it could easily have been either the first or, as it is, the last chapter. Either one would have worked.
I know. And it's, oh my gosh, it's something that both of us are learning so much. I mean, if Denise were here, we would just be having a laugh right now because we are not the people that should be telling others how to rest. Like, we have this running joke where we criticizing the other, like, you're the one who works harder and needs more rest. No, you're the one that works harder. I can't believe what you can accomplish. And so we have this kind of little repartee. But that chapter was really important to us, and we talked a lot about it because rest needs to undergird everything else that we're doing in our ministry at work. And if we don't, then we're kind of starting off with believing we're God, right? From the very beginning. And that's when things get really messy, when we stop realizing that we have any limitations. I also thought a lot about, and I know you've written about this some in your own work too, Mark, which I've read, about justice and rest. That, when we, and I would say, sadly, I've just started to learn this during the last couple of years, when we don't rest as leaders and model that for others, then we are very much in danger of stealing the rest of others when people feel that they constantly have to live up to our expectations. And that's not a good condition for a workplace. And so I think we need to think about that, how we provide rest for those who are on the margins in our workplaces. And what does that look like? And I think that can be a very powerful systemic change. Yeah, so I just want to keep thinking about that in relationship to work, but just in the relationship to the rest of life too.
Right. For the sake of the listeners, of course, rest here does not mean sleep. It's not another word for vacation. It can include those things, but it's really about laying down, volitionally laying down power, control, assertion, dominance over our schedule, which is often the way it feels like when we're in our hyper work week kind of mode. And instead, cultivating daily, as well as weekly, as well as more than that, cultivating a capacity for a remembrance of our own limitations, and in any case, of our imitation of a God of rest. Talk more about those theological underpinnings from your point of view. What is it that rest provides and requires?
I think it's saying very powerfully through practice, right, that God is God and I am not. And reflecting on all the ways in which that applies to my work and just my life in general. I do think sleep is very important and can be a kind of spiritual practice. It's in some ways where we're closest to death and we're closest to true life. I mean, we have a deep sense, in order to sleep well, you need to feel safe, you need to feel comfortable, you need to trust that you wake up. And that is so it's very powerful spiritual discipline. I want to write more about that at some point. But I do think, what are the ways in which we need to lay our work down and say, I've done all that I can here. And it's not that and this is where I think I've been growing recently, it's not just shifting our work to someone else.
Right.
It was like, my husband always jokes with me because I'm going out, here's the 10 things you have to do. We're both academics, so we always just do what needs to be done. We don't have really very divided roles, but it's very funny. And I'm like, he sometimes does that with me, probably less than I did that with him. But it is the laying down and reflecting on what we need to lay down in order to rest. And then also the reflecting on what rest looks like for us, developing some kind of rhythm. And, my co-author, Denise Daniels, has written quite a bit about the Sabbath and Sabbath practices, but we can have little bits of rest during the course of a day. We should have probably a longer rest once a week. Of course, we have our daily rest with our sleep and other ways of resting. Some people are fans, and I am, of taking like a monthly rest that's a more of a longer spiritual retreat. Obviously, we have a yearly rest. And so thinking about those snippets and where you need to increase so that your sense of being the main motivator of the world decreases.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's living more truthfully. I don't know how to exactly express it better. It's living more truthfully and with an accurate relationship to God.
Right.
And it's the very hardest part of my spiritual practice. I'm so bad at this. I know everyone who knows me who's listening is having a big laugh right now.
Well, I do think there's a great pressure in some environments, especially, to be omnicompetent, multifunctional, and omnipresent. And those are all just fictional things that technology only further encourages. And so and now with AI at our fingertips, it does feel like we're creating for ourselves a culture that is actually constantly fomenting the exact opposite of a boundaried, healthy, restful, rest-informed, rest-shaped life. And I think it's a very important chapter in the book.
Thank you for that. Yeah.
I do think that the big backdrop to your book is one of the things that intrigued me about it, because you take an example of things concentrated in a particular context, i.e. work, but really it becomes a kind of lens through which you can also see the wider patterns that exist in non-work settings that are the things that are crippling a lot of the wider cultural dynamics are some of the same things that are crippling them within the workplace setting, which is no great surprise because we do actually inevitably take our whole selves to work.
That's right.
But I guess I'm just wondering, as you, no doubt, as a sociologist, are constantly moving between the particularities of the research and the wider cultural moment that we're in, what did you find yourself thinking about, and what was motivating or challenging or surprising to you?
So I thought a lot, I love that question, Mark, because I thought a lot about identities, and we struggle as American Christians with where to place our central identity. So sociologists call this concept your master identity. So the identity that all other identities fit under, right? And as Christians, we want our master identity to be our Christian identity. And that's when things we believe, are sort of more right in the world. And so much of the struggle that people face in their work is some kind of misplaced identity struggle. So that's one kind of thing where, for some people, their work identity takes over everything else and all other identities fit under that. There's problems with that. There's problems with people who want to find work, are underemployed, and want very much to feel like they're contributing and to have a workplace identity. So there's like an identity, a struggle there. We also think a lot, Denise and I talked a lot about rest and the way in which the last chapter of the book is about that. But I think there's a wider struggle with limitations in American Christianity. We have not done a very good job thinking about our physical limitations, how we care for our bodies in the midst of everything else. And this idea, which is very much a part of the Christian tradition, that God is God and I am not, right? And when that idea gets subverted, then everything just goes haywire. And there are so many people in American workplaces that are operating without any sense of limitation and really making their own lives and others' lives very difficult, especially for those who have power. And that's not just at work, but really transcends other kinds of things as well.
Right.
And then thirdly, we wanted there to be a theme of justice in this book and to talk openly about that. And that's a sensitive topic, I think, especially in these days. But as I said, we started out the project thinking about, women's work lives and the ways that they have sometimes been marginalized at work. And we wanted this undercurrent of thinking about gender marginalization, racial marginalization, religious marginalization itself to be like an undercurrent of the book that framed things around. And that's something that we have never fully known how to think about in the Christian church, in the American Christian church. And we, need to go to other traditions within Christianity and other places in the world where I think they have a more robust way of thinking about those issues. But Denise and I wanted very much for that to be an undercurrent of the book. And, we see that all around us, the need for us to develop a robust model of Christian justice and then to be open to thinking through our role as individual Christians in that model and the redemption
amen
of the
to
world.
all of that, Elaine.
Yeah.
I think you and Denise have done a great service by writing this. And I do think that it does do what you just described, namely exposes the injustices in a certain way, but also the implicit ways in which pursuing justice in this deeper grounding that you're offering and in a greater degree of freedom is really critical to the ability to be able to pursue justice, not as an issue-centric approach, but as a way of being in the world, which then inevitably drives us to particular issues and particular contexts where change, and particularly changes towards justice, really do need to be pursued. They often get stopped way back before you ever even come to that moment for the reasons that we've been discussing. And I think you both have, in this book, have contributed a great resource to help people think through the variety of lenses that they could, and I would hope would consider as they come about going around and doing all the things that are part of their work life. And I'm just very, very thankful again for you and for this book, and commend it to those who are listening. So, Elaine, thank you as always for this conversation. I'm very thankful for what you're doing and thankful for the additional insights that you've shared today.
Oh, gosh. Wow. It's been such a privilege to talk to you. And I respect so much what you've done and what you're doing. So this is just such a delight for me. Thank you.
Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comment Magazine and Fuller Seminary. Peter Labberton is our engineer and editor. Evan Rosa is our producer. For more information about Comment Magazine, visit comment.org, where you can subscribe, read the current magazine issue, and browse their archive. Fuller Seminary is an evangelical, multi-denominational graduate institution committed to providing indispensable formational education for diverse Christian leaders everywhere. For information, visit fuller.edu. I'm your host, Mark Labberton. Thanks for listening with me.